My name is Harzing. I'm Professor of International Management at Middlesex University. And I guess many AIB researchers, if they know me at all, associate me mostly with international mobility research. It's often called expatriate management research. So that's why I picked this as the theme for my Fellows Cafe. I haven't actually attended any Fellows Cafes before this conference, so I was a bit hazy about what the expected format would be. My understanding is that they're largely free-flowing discussions among a group of people interested in a topic, with people asking questions and making comments, but it's a bit harder to do that online because we can't all speak at the same time. It's easy to accidentally interrupt each other. So what I reasoned is that given that you're attending my cafe, you're probably at least a little bit interested in my views on where the field is going. So I've prepared a really short presentation, probably 5 to 7 minutes to kick off the discussion. And then we can have a free-flowing discussion with your questions and comments. Before we start, because it's an online format and we're all here together, but it's a bit hard to connect if we don't know each other. So I would like to ask you a few questions and I'll just ask you to raise your hands in response to the questions. So it would be helpful for those of you who can switch their videos on to switch your video on, even if it's just for a few minutes in the introduction. I won't be asking you to introduce yourself one by one because that would probably take up most of the cafe, but I'll ask you a couple of questions to get a feel for the people in the cafe. So for those of you who have their videos switched on, can you tell me, is anyone a PhD student? If you are a PhD student, please raise your hands. So yeah, we have a few PhD students there, great. Anyone assistant professor or lecturer? Yeah, at least one there. Anyone associate professor or reader, senior lecturer? Yeah. And do we have any full professors here? Yeah, I see a few that I know, but are there any more? Yeah. So we have a whole range of experiences with people just starting out in the field and people who've been there for a while. So that's really good. Can I just check a little bit on kind of geographical distribution? Is there anyone from the UK, where I'm currently located? Yeah, there's a few, I know. Anyone from Europe more generally? Yeah, couple. Anyone from North America? I don't expect so, given the time. No, nobody. Anyone from Latin America either, I guess. Anyone from Africa? No one from Africa? Anyone from Asia? There must be quite a few, yes. Anyone from Australia or New Zealand? None. Okay. So who is currently working or maybe doing a PhD in a country that's not their country of birth? Yeah, I think it's about 2/3 of the audience. And who is speaking English as a foreign language? Okay, yeah, so that's also probably nearly 3/4 of us. So when we get to the discussion section, if you feel a bit awkward about your English, don't worry. Most of us are struggling with this. If you prefer in the discussion to type your question in the chat, that's absolutely fine as well. I'll keep an eye on the chat and I will try to answer questions in the chat as well. Okay, so I'll now try and share my screen so I can kick off a short presentation. Just bear with me while I'll find my slides. So moving to international mobility research. When I started this research in the early 90s, There was quite a bit of research in the field, but it was still in its infancy, having started probably in the middle of the 1970s. And the population studied was quite homogeneous. It was mostly company-initiated expatriates. They tended to be white males with dependent spouses coming from what we call weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. And they were generally moving to what was then called developing countries. The topics that were studied were mostly expatriate adjustment. That has remained a popular topic throughout the years. Expatriate performance, selection, training, compensation, all the traditional HR functions. And there was a bit of work on the role of expatriation. So why do companies send out expatriates? But that was all very, very descriptive. The research methods in general were mostly survey research, use of secondary data, and the type of analysis that were used were mostly very, very descriptive or very simple regression analysis, which was quite normal at the time. So then when we moved to the 2010s, the population studies became a bit more diverse. We were studying all sorts of types of expatriates. I've been amazed at how many types of expatriates people have been able to distinguish. Self-initiated expatriates, frequent travelers, female expatriates, LGBT expatriates, academic expatriates, sports, religious, military, humanitarian, and even starting to look at different generations, looking at millennial expatriates. But also people started to realize that expatriation is just a specific form of a general phenomenon, migration. So people started to look at migrants more generally, initially mostly at highly skilled migrants, and more recently also at all migrant groups. But in terms of home countries, the focus tended to still be mostly on Western home countries, even though there was a large section of research on Japanese expatriates and small pockets from other countries. The topics that were studied in that era were, again, mostly adjustment, selection, and training for all of these groups. And people started to connect expatriation with the headquarters subsidiary literature and the knowledge-based views. So looking at expatriates as a way to connect headquarters and subsidiaries and to transfer knowledge from headquarters to subsidiaries and vice versa. And looking at the research methods, surveys were still popular, typically smaller skill surveys and also interview-based studies. And a lot of studies using secondary data, in particular one Japanese database, which provided a lot of information on various company characteristics and also the type of employees at subsidiaries. The whole field started to develop very much as a separate field, especially at the European Academy of Management, which had a special track for expatriate management. And I personally felt that it increasingly started to isolate itself from mainstream international business. And it specialized itself very much, looking, as I said before, at very different types of expatriates in a fairly descriptive fashion. So I felt the field was getting very specialized, very fragmented, with all studies being individual studies and not much integration. In fact, we could say that's quite natural for a field that it's finding its place and its identity, but I didn't really feel it led to a very coherent body of research. So where do I think we should go? Well, first of all, I would say focus the population studies on a broader group of internationally mobile people. I've long had a bit of a bugbear about self-initiated expatriates. I know the term is used very frequently. I've probably used it myself in some articles, but if we look at it, are they different from highly skilled migrants? What's the difference between a self-initiated expatriate and a highly skilled migrant? Looking at the role of emerging economies and emerging economy multinationals in the world these days, shouldn't we be looking far more at international mobility coming from these countries to Western countries? Then looking at repatriation, it's still seen as kind of a stepchild in the literature. Whereas I think recent research has shown that repatriation is probably as important or maybe even more important than expatriation. Most of all though, I feel that we should be looking at far better integration with the mainstream international business and management literature and grounding our studies in the field of mobility and expatriate management. With theories from those literatures. If we look at, for instance, strategy, we can be looking at mobility and knowledge transfer, the impact of mobility on performance, really working with the micro foundations approach to strategy. We can be looking at diaspora research, migration research, the role of social networks, the role of mobility in international trade and international entrepreneurship. Obviously, the role of language in international business that I've been active in as well is really important for expatriation because language really pervades every element of mobility. International organization behavior, obviously a very important source of theories as well. What does expatriation do for identity of individuals? The role of ethnic and cultural similarity between expatriates and host country employees. Leadership literature and also the teams literature and the virtual teams literature. HRM, of course, remains important, but these days we look at global talent management more broadly rather than just looking at expatriation. In terms of research methods, I would like us to be far more creative than we've been in the past, where we focus not just in expatriate management, but in IB more generally, mostly on surveys, secondary data and interviews. Experiments, I think, are a promising way to study some phenomena, not on their own, but supported possibly by interviews and surveys. Dyadic surveys, if we're studying the interaction between expatriates and local employees, we should be asking both perspectives, not just one of them. If we look at qualitative research, maybe we can start looking at things like diary studies and ethnography rather than simply focusing on interviews. And then finally, what about international mobility during and after COVID-19? We all know that physical mobility has been restricted. So if we look at multinational corporations, are there any mechanisms that can replace the knowledge transfer, the control, the training and management development roles of international mobility? Should we be looking at other mechanisms more than we have in the past? And maybe third country nationals will become even more important than they have been in the past, because some countries will have travel bans, so mobility will not be possible. So maybe we should be looking at other countries for our internationally mobile people. And I was also wondering, can we have international mobility from home? What does mobility look like if we can't move physically? Is that even possible? Then more generally, and I guess that's especially important for junior academics, but I feel in fact for everyone, don't be afraid to be different. When you are studying specific groups of internationally mobile people, especially if you're a female researcher studying female expatriates, if you're a Chinese researcher studying Chinese expatriates, we're often accused of doing me-search. Doing research that's only important because you are of that gender or nationality or background. But I think seminal researchers did me search too, because they were white Western males and they studied white Western male expatriates. So doing me search is not a problem because you actually understand more of where these people are coming from. So you might have an added advantage. Of course, ideally, you would be working with people from other perspectives as well. So you can have, as a researcher, you can have both perspectives, both the inside perspective and the external perspective. But I really think that demographically different researchers should be studying different population and topics. That's why we have variety. I would also say, don't be afraid to be critical. Established theories in this field or any field are not set in stone. Don't forget that some of the work that has been done was based on really unsophisticated research methods, where we would now say, not so sure whether we would be able to get away with this today. The samples might have been very limited because the phenomena were so new. So don't be afraid to say, I don't think these findings apply in the current context, and I'm proposing something new. In fact, my first ever article, which was about expatriation, really was very, very critical, and I was very hesitant about publishing this because I was still a PhD student. So I asked my supervisor and I said, well, can I do this? Because it seems like I'm criticizing some of the top people in the field who've been around for a long time. And he said, well, don't be afraid, because this is what academic research is about. It's about progress. As long as you're polite, as long as you argue what your concerns are, it's fine. It's not personal. You're talking about their work. You're not talking about them as individuals. And most academics will be far happier if you engage with their work and improve it than if you slavishly follow it and tell them how wonderful they are. So that's about what I wanted to tell you. So let's move to the discussion section, and I'll stop sharing my screen. As I said, I'm happy to take questions in the chat, but given that we are a relatively small group, I am equally happy for you to speak. And if you want to briefly introduce yourself before asking your question, I'm really happy with that as well. Okay, so if you have a question and you would like to ask it personally, can you please raise either your own hand or your Zoom hand if you know where to find this. You all know what? Yes, Martina?
I'm unmuted, I think. Thank you very much, Anne-Will. My name is Martina Śliwa, and I work at the University of Essex in the UK. And I've done some research on mobility as well, in particular in relation to academics, but also performance artists. Mm-hmm. What I wanted to partly ask, but partly share a reflection as well, which is that, that's my sense, and I just wondered what you think about it. Both Anne-Will and other participants, please. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, there was exactly because expats were associated, the notion was associated with people who were white, who were predominantly male, who were privileged in so many different ways. There was also something glamorous attached to this idea of being an expatriate. You know, this was an elite privileged position. Now that weird countries are actually becoming, possibly increasingly less wealthy and, less democratic as we're experiencing, but the idea that this privilege might no longer be sustainable in the same way. I just wonder about this kind of, so there used to be, from what I would see, more of a kind of clear-cut distinction between who is an expat, who is a migrant. Self-initiated expatriate wasn't just somebody who was educated as opposed to an uneducated economic migrant, but basically self-initiated expatriate was coming to take up a well-paid job, whereas a migrant wasn't. And now, people who come as self-initiated expatriates and might be well-educated, highly skilled, might not necessarily have highly skilled jobs available to them. So that boundary between who is an expat, whether self-initiated or sent by a company, and who is a migrant, I believe is very much blurred. And even people who can be still sent by companies to go abroad might not be coming to situations where, again, they are amongst the richest of the host country. So my general reflections are really around this kind of unsettling, this understanding of self-initiated expatriates versus ones who are sent by a company, and those who are really expatriates versus those that are migrants, that perhaps we need to think about it more on a spectrum, on a continuum.
Exactly.
And also to see that it's not just that a person's situation changes, but basically as we go through lives, the back context, the economic context of people's lives changes. I mean, Brexit is a very obvious example for us in the UK, and all these debates about, and I'll shut up in a second, but just to throw, this as an example as well, how, for example, many scientists or many healthcare professionals are highly skilled and probably never saw themselves as economic migrants, and yet with new thresholds for minimum income, they might find themselves in a situation of people who actually don't have it easy to gain the rights to be in the country and work in the country, might be finding themselves as illegal migrants because they're seen as people who don't earn enough to be really seen as highly skilled or self-initiated expatriates. So I just wondered what others' ideas are about these things.
Very, very interesting points, Martina. And I'm immediately thinking, of course, as you are, about the concept of fluidity, which we have applied in a different context. And in international business in generally, and I suspect in business and management research in general, we've been very much thinking in categories. Someone is either in one category or another. But this is a perfect example of how that might have been possible 50 years ago when the field started, but really isn't a good way to think about this right now. Because as you say, the boundaries are more blurred, but even more so, someone's position might change depending on political and economic environment, but someone might change depending on their personal change as well. So if I would ask all of you, and it's a little bit difficult because I only see a few videos, but maybe you can use the Zoom thumbs up if you want to answer yes. Who would see, because many of you were working in a country that's not their country of birth. So do you see yourself as an expatriate or a migrant? Maybe I can ask people who sees themselves as an expatriate. Just raise your hand or raise your thumb. Who sees themselves as an expatriate? Martina? Nobody else? Who sees themselves as a migrant? Cordula, a little bit, yeah? Who sees themselves as a migrant? Yeah? So for those of you who see themselves as an expatriate, and I think there was Martina and Cordula, given that Martina initiated the discussion. Cordula, why would you see yourself as an expatriate rather than a migrant?
I think migrants may have eventually not necessarily this chewing gum relationship where they can go back, because for me the expat relationship is going somewhere and going back, which is a traditional work assigned expatriate, and that is not necessarily my case, because I mean I've been expat to different places on a shorter term, but now I'm actually living and I have found a new household. My kids have dual citizenship in the country that is my host country. So I would now today perceive myself more as a migrant, even if as a European I'm not really feeling myself very foreign in a European context. I just have, I'm in a neighboring country. So it's not like if I, as European, I would go to Japan. I think I would feel far more estranged in a very unfamiliar surrounding culture-wise.
Yeah. So really, it depends also on the cultural and economic distance between your birth country and the country you're currently living in, as to whether you feel more of an expat or a migrant. And as you say, Cordula, and that would be probably my situation as well. When you first moved internationally, you might have felt an expatriate. But then when moving to another country where you intended to stay longer, you might have felt more of a migrant. Personally, I felt a migrant in Australia because I thought I would stay there. But then I moved to another country. So we never know what we are until probably the end of our lives. And we can reflect back and say, well, at that stage I felt more like a migrant. At that stage I felt like an expatriate. But would it matter? Why don't we just talk about internationally mobile people rather than attaching these labels? Because my problem with the labels is that most people talk about expatriates, as Martina said, as something glamorous, someone highly paid, privileged position, whereas migrants typically has the connotation of being low skilled, being more closer to refugees than to expatriates. And I'm always struck by the contrast if we look at the UK, where people talk about British expats in Spain, which are basically people who've migrated to Spain to spend their retirement there. But Spanish people coming to London to work in cafes are called migrants. It's exactly the same situation. So we attach a value judgment by using a particular label. So I think it makes much more sense to keep this fluid and talk about talk about different stages in your life, different countries, different internal and external environment. Martina, and then Cordula again.
Okay, yeah, just quickly. So in the research that I was referring to before, we refer to academics and theatrical artists as representatives of what we call the mobile middle, but still the mobile middle assumes that there is something in the middle, and we say it's neither nor and at the same time both. However, I think there is something more dynamic to it because as Fiona's comment, for example, suggests there's something about permanence, and as Cordula was saying, you know, you start with a certain position, then your situation changes, all the external circumstances change. For me, they on a personal level, I never came to the UK for economic reasons. In fact, if I had stayed back in Poland, the sort of background that I have in Poland, if I look at my own family and my closest friends, they are all much better off than me living in London trying to make ends meet on an academic salary. So then when the Brexit discourse suddenly framed me as a migrant, I just was so confused. It's like, well, these people don't understand, you know. So that's the kind of clarity. But I really agree with what Fiona has said as well. Let's reclaim that label. Let's reclaim that label, and let's not allow those sort of notions around status. You can only be an expat, you know, if you are from a if you are a man and if you are very rich. And then we look at those retired people from the UK who go to Spain to live there and then still call themselves expert. No, I like the idea of reclaiming the migrant label. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it also makes it more more natural to go to the migration literature, because I think we have so much to learn from the migration literature, the diaspora literature, that in some ways is much more advanced in these phenomena, and also takes a longer term historical perspective, which we have tended not to do so much in international business, naturally, because it is a fairly young discipline, even though international mobility and international trade goes back millennia, but the whole the whole tradition, international business research tradition, is still fairly recent. Cordula, you wanted to reflect on this as well?
Yes, I wanted just to add to the confusion, because you can see in academia, we have coined this idea of the self-initiate expat.
Yeah.
And that is really, you know, an artificial construction in theory to probably also make it more noble to do research on people who can be migrants, sometimes are even refugees, and who insert themselves in a host country through, economic adaptation. And now we call them self-initiate expats. So if
Exactly.
you would talk to a business person of an SIE, they would not understand, apart they would have read some of our articles, otherwise they don't know about this definition. So I think there's certainly the idea as well in the self-initiate expat that you go to a country for maybe any reason, but you are not necessarily intending to stay there forever, but then eventually you meet somebody. I think love is a very strong attractor, and then you make a new life in a country that initially was not intended. So I think this idea of definitions also brings us back to reflect on our own research, because self-initiated expat sounds more noble, I would say, than migrant.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though the group of migrants is far larger and in that sense more worthy of study. I noticed a comment from Fiona in the chat that I would briefly like to reflect on, and then I would like to broaden the discussion, because so far we've heard quite a bit from the UK and Europe, and I see that there are quite a few people from Asia as well, so I would like to hear their perspective as well. Fiona, you mentioned that the point about research is interesting, and in anthropology, and you are taking an anthropological perspective on international business in your work. People frown upon studying your own community because the norms are so familiar, and you're not interrogating them, you're not questioning them. Is this a valid critique of the seminal text under discussion, in a sense that we've said, well, it was mostly white male researchers studying white male population? Possibly. We would need to, and that's a very interesting perspective to take. We would need to go back to that literature and see, well, is there anything in here that really doesn't make sense if we look at a more diverse population? But more generally, I think your point is, should we be careful doing research? As I said, I think you have really valid reasons for doing research, but what I find is most productive is having diverse research teams. And I noticed this in a couple of the papers I'm working in at the moment, where we have academics from a whole range of nationalities, and not just from different European countries, but from Asia as well, from Latin America. And especially if you're dealing with concepts of mobility, if you're dealing with concepts of ethnic and cultural diversity, it's amazing to see how even in your own research team, you can have major discussions about particular concepts. I distinctly remember a discussion with one of my PhD students who was studying ethnic Chinese expatriates going to China, and the struggles they had in interacting with the local population. And her topic was very interesting, and she did a great PhD, but she also wanted to do a survey with European expatriates, and she kept talking about ethnicity. And I said, well, to Europeans, ethnicity really doesn't make a lot of sense, because yeah, we have different shades of white, but most of us are Caucasian, so we don't know what ethnicity is really. So the terms ethnicity, culture, race have very different meanings in different countries. And having a diverse research team really allows you to discuss all of that before you go to your participants, and the research will be all the stronger for that, I think. Yes, ethnicity isn't just color, I realize that. German is an ethnic identity. We could talk forever about the boundaries between race and ethnicity and culture, but we also need to realize that our respondents might have their own opinion about what ethnicity, race and culture is. I see that we're actually very close to the end of this session. We only have a few more minutes left. Time has flown. I would just like to have a quick look at the chat, and Kate indicates she would like to see more research about underprivileged, vulnerable group of migrants, difficult to access for many reasons. I think there are a couple of people working in this field at the moment. Maria Elo is doing a lot of work in this. And I know that Janet, one of the mentees I'm talking to tomorrow, is also studying this group. I think we're moving to an area that it's studied in industrial relations as well. More vulnerable people, labor market issues, and in some cases we're actually bordering on modern slavery rather than migration. So I agree, it's a very important area to study. Then interested to hear your thoughts on the practical impact of the field. Are companies picking up on these research insights? I think that's a brilliant question, but one that will probably take a long time to answer. I don't think the expatriate management field is unique in this, in that we do not engage enough with practice, even though it could be a very practical field. And in fact, my very first study on the persistent myth of expatriate failure rate tapped into that, in a sense that I said, well, I just don't believe that expatriates have a 40% failure rate. If they did, companies would have long changed their practices. So has anyone ever talked to HR managers about this? No, of course not. They just repeat what's in the literature. Kate, I would love to give you a voice, but we will be cutting off in about 30 seconds. So
don't worry, that's a great answer. I will follow their research.
Yep, and Sai, likewise. I'm more than happy to continue the discussion with any of you, and I'm really looking forward to see a lot of research in this area, taking more creative angles in terms of research methods, in terms of populations we study, in terms of theories we use, and certainly in terms of practical insights we can gain from this. I know from the previous cafe that although the session will end, we can stay on in the Zoom session. So if you want to stay on in the Zoom session for another 5 to 10 minutes and you want to talk to each other or ask me a question, I'm happy to stay until 11 o'clock, but many of you will have other sessions to go to, so don't feel shy to just drop out. Thank you very much for attending. It's the official end of the session. Lovely to see you all.